At the same time, Cortés sent some troops into the state of Michoacán, who penetrated as far as the Pacific Ocean, and as they returned visited some of the rich provinces situated in the north. Cortés founded settlements in all the parts of the country which appeared to him advantageous: at Zacatula upon the shores of the Pacific, at Calaman in Michoacán, at Santisteban near Tampico, at Medellin near Vera Cruz, and c. Immediately after the pacification of the country, Cortés entrusted Cristóbal de Olid with the command of a considerable force in order to establish a colony in Honduras, and at the same time Olid was to explore the southern coast of that province and to seek for a strait which should form a communication between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But carried away by the pride of command, Olid had no sooner reached his destination than he declared himself independent, whereupon Cortés immediately dispatched one of his relations to arrest the culprit, and set out himself, accompanied by Guatimazin, at the head of 100 horsemen and 50-foot soldiers, on the 12th of October, 1524. After crossing the provinces of Coatzacoalco, Tabasco, and Yucatan, and enduring all kinds of privations in the course of a most trying march over marshy and shifting ground, and across a perfect ocean of undulating forests, the detachment was approaching the province of Aculan, when Cortés was told of the existence of a plot, formed, as was said, by Guatimazin and the principal Indian chiefs. Its aim was to seize the first opportunity to massacre both officers and soldiers, after which the march to Honduras was to be continued, the settlements were to be destroyed, and then there was to be a return to Mexico, where during a general rising there would doubtless be small difficulty experienced in getting rid of the invaders. Guatimazin in vain protested his innocence, in which there is every reason to believe. He was hung, as well as several of the Aztec nobles, upon the branches of a ceiba tree which shaded the road. Bernal Diaz del Castillo says, "The execution of Guatimazin was very unjust, and we were all agreed in condemning it." But Prescott says, "If Cortés had consulted but his own interest and his renown, he should have spared him, for he was the living trophy of his victory, as a man keeps gold in the lining of his coat." At length the Spaniards reached Aculan, a flourishing town, where they refreshed themselves after their journey in excellent quarters. When they set out again, it was in the direction of the Lake of Piton, a part of the country where the population was easily converted to Christianity. We shall not dwell upon the sufferings and misery which tried the expedition in these sparsely peopled countries, until it arrived at San Gil de Buena Vista, upon the Golfo Dolce, where Cortés, after receiving the news of the execution of Olid and the re-establishment of the central authority, embarked upon his return to Mexico. At this time he entrusted to Alvarado the command of 300 infantry, 160 cavalry, and 4 cannon, with a body of Indian auxiliaries, with which he set out for the south of Mexico to conquer Guatemala. He reduced to submission the provinces of Zacatchalan, Tehuantepec, Soconusco, Utlatlan, and laid the foundations of the town of Guatemala la Vieja. When some time afterwards he made a voyage to Spain, he was named by Charles V. governor of the countries which he had conquered. 3 years had not expired after the conquest, before a territory 1,200 miles in length upon the seaboard of the Atlantic, and miles upon that of the Pacific, had submitted to the Castilian crown, and with but few exceptions was in a state of perfect tranquility. The return of Cortés to Mexico from the useless expedition to Honduras, which had wasted so much time and caused almost as great sufferings to the Spaniards as the conquest of Mexico, had taken place but a few days when he received the news that he was temporarily replaced by another commander, and was invited to repair to Spain to exculpate himself from certain charges. He was not in any haste to comply with this order, hoping that it might be revoked, but his indefatigable calumniators and his implacable enemies, both in Spain and Mexico, preferred accusations against him after such a manner that he found himself obliged to go and make his defense, to state his wrongs, and boldly to claim the approval of his conduct. Cortés therefore started, accompanied by his friend Sandoval, as well as by Tapia and several Aztec chiefs, amongst whom was a son of Montezuma. He disembarked at Palos in May 1528, at the same place where Columbus had landed 35 years before, and he was welcomed with the same enthusiasm and rejoicings as the discoverer of America had been. Here Cortés met with Pizarro, then at the outset of his career, who was come to solicit support of the Spanish government. Cortés afterwards set out for Toledo, where the court then was. The mere announcement of his return had produced a complete change in public opinion. His unexpected arrival at once contradicted the idea that he harbored any projects of revolt and independence. Charles V. saw that public feeling would be outraged at the thought of punishing a man who had added its greatest gem to the crown of Castile. And so the journey of Cortés became one continual triumph in the midst of crowds of people greater than had been ever known before. The houses and streets of the large towns and of the villages, says Prescott, were filled with spectators impatient to contemplate the hero, whose single arm might be said, in some sort, to have conquered an empire for Spain, and who, to borrow the language of an old historian, marched in all the pomp and glory, not of a great vassal, but of an independent monarch. Charles V., after having granted several audiences to Cortés, and bestowed upon him those particular marks of favor which are termed important by courtiers, deigned to accept from him the empire which he had conquered for him, and the magnificent presents which he brought. But he considered that he had fully recompensed him when he had given Cortés the title of Marquis de la Val d'Ojaca, and the post of Captain General of New Spain, without, however, restoring to him the civil government, a power which had been formerly delegated to him by the Junta of Vera Cruz. Cortés, after his marriage with the niece of the Duc de Bejar, who belonged to one of the first families in Spain, accompanied the emperor, who was on his way to Italy, to the port of embarkation. But the general, soon becoming tired of the frivolities of a court, so little in accordance with the active habits of his past life, set out again for Mexico in 1530 and landed at Villarica. After his arrival, he underwent some annoyance caused by the Audiencia, which had exercised the power in his absence, and which had instituted lawsuits against him, and he also found himself in conflict with the new civil junta on the subject of military affairs. The Marquis de la Val withdrew himself to Cuernavaca, where he had immense estates, and busied himself with agriculture. He was the means of introducing the sugar cane and the mulberry into Mexico. He also encouraged the cultivation of hemp and flax, and the breeding, on a large scale, of merino sheep. But this peaceable life without adventures could not long satisfy the enterprising spirit of Cortés. In 1532, he equipped 2 squadrons destined to make voyages of discovery in the northwest of the Pacific. The latter expedition reached the southern extremity of the peninsula of California without attaining the object sought, namely the discovery of a strait uniting the Pacific with the Atlantic. Cortés himself met with no better success in 1536 in the Vermilion Sea, Gulf of California. 3 years later, a concluding expedition, of which Cortés gave the command to Aloha, penetrated to the farthest extremity of the Gulf, and then, sailing along the exterior side of the peninsula, reached the 29 degrees of north latitude. From thence the chief of the expedition sent back one of his ships to Cortés, while the rest proceeded northwards, but from that time nothing more is heard of them. Such was the unhappy result of the expeditions of Cortés, which, while they did not bring him in a single ducat, cost him not less than 300,000 gold castellanos. But they at least had the result of making known the coast of the Pacific Ocean, from the Bay of Panama as far as Colorado. The tour of the Californian peninsula was made, and it was thus discovered that what had been imagined to be an island was in reality a part of the continent. The whole of the Vermilion Sea, or Sea of Cortés, as the Spaniards justly named it, was carefully explored, and it was ascertained that, instead of having an outlet as was supposed to the north, it was in reality only a gulf deeply hollowed into the continent. Cortés had not been able to fit out these expeditions without coming into antagonism with the Viceroy Don Antonio de Mendoza, whom the emperor had sent to Mexico, an appointment which had wounded the feelings of the Marquis de la Val. Wearied with these continual annoyances and indignant at finding his prerogative as Captain General, if not absolutely ignored, at least perpetually questioned, Cortés left Mexico and once more set out for Spain. But this journey was not destined at all to resemble the first. Grown old, disgusted with life, and betrayed by fortune, the conquistador had no longer anything to expect from government. He had not to wait long before receiving proof of this. One day he pressed through the crowd which surrounded the emperor's coach and mounted upon the step of the door. Charles V pretended not to recognize him and asked who this man was. Cortés answered proudly, "It is the man who has given you more states than your father left you towns." By this time public interest was diverted from Mexico, which had not yielded as much as had been expected from it, and was centered upon the marvelous riches of Peru. Cortés was, however, received with honor by the Supreme Council of the Indies and permitted to state his complaints before it, but the debates upon the subject were endlessly drawn out, and he could obtain no redress. In 1541, during the disastrous expedition of Charles V against Algiers, Cortés, who was serving in it as a volunteer, but whose counsels had not been listened to, had the misfortune to lose 3 great carved emeralds, jewels which would have sufficed for the ransom of an empire. Upon his return, he renewed his solicitations, but with the same want of success. His grief over this injustice and these repeated disappointments was so deep that his health suffered severely. He died far from the scene of his exploits on the 10th of November, 1547, at Castilleja de la Cuesta, at the very moment when he was making preparations to return to America. He was a true knight-errant, says Prescott. Of all that glorious troop of adventurers which the Spain of the 16th century sent forth to a career of discovery and conquest, there was not one more deeply imbued with the spirit of romantic enterprise than Fernando Cortés. Strife was his delight, and he loved to attempt an enterprise by its most difficult side. This passion for the romantic might have reduced the conqueror of Mexico to the part of a common adventurer, but Cortés was certainly a profound politician and a great captain, if one is justified in giving this name to a man who accomplished great actions by his own unassisted genius. There is no other example in history of so great an enterprise having been carried to a successful end with such inadequate means. It may be said with truth that Cortés conquered Mexico with his own resources alone. His influence over the minds of his soldiers was the natural result of their confidence in his ability, but it must be attributed also to his popular manners, which rendered him eminently fit to lead a band of adventurers. When he had attained to a higher rank, if Cortés displayed more of pomp, his veterans at least continued on the same terms of intimacy with him as before. In finishing this portrait of the conquistador, we shall quote the upright and veracious Bernal Diaz, with whose sentiments we fully agree. He preferred his name of Cortés to all the titles by which he might be addressed, and he had good reasons for it, for the name of Cortés is as famous in our days as that of Caesar amongst the Romans or Hannibal amongst the Carthaginians. The old chronicler ends by a touch which vividly depicts the religious spirit of the 16th century. Perhaps he was destined to receive his reward only in a better world, and I fully believe it to be so, for he was an honest knight, very sincere in his devotions to the Virgin, to the Apostle St. Peter, and to all the saints. Chapter 3. The Conquerors of Central America. The Triple Alliance, Francisco Pizarro and his brothers, Don Diego d'Almagro, first attempts Peru, its extent, people and kings, capture of Atahualpa, his ransom and death, Pedro de Alvarado, Almagro in Chile, strife among the conquerors, trial and execution of Almagro, expeditions of Gonzalo Pizarro and Orellana, assassination of Francisco Pizarro, rebellion and execution of his brother Gonzalo. The information which had been gained by Balboa as to the riches of the countries situated to the south of Panama had scarcely become known to the Spaniards before several expeditions were organized to attempt the conquest of them. But all had failed, either from the means used being insufficient or from the commanders not being equal to the greatness of the undertaking. It must be confessed also that the localities explored by these first adventurers, these pioneers, as they would be called nowadays, did not at all come up to what Spanish greed had expected from them, and for this reason, that all the attempts had been hitherto made upon what was then called terra firma, a country preeminently unhealthy, mountainous, marshy and covered with forests, The inhabitants were few, but of so warlike a disposition that they had added another obstacle to all those which nature had strewn with so prodigal a hand in the path of the invaders. Little by little, therefore, the enthusiasm had cooled, and the wonderful narratives of Balboa were mentioned only to be turned into ridicule. Francisco Pizarro. Francisco Pizarro. From an old print. There lived, however, in Panama, a man well able to weigh the truth of the reports which had been circulated concerning the richness of the countries bathed by the Pacific. This man was Francisco Pizarro, who had accompanied Manes de Balboa to the southern sea, and who now associated with himself two other adventurers, Diego de Almagro and Ferdinand de Luque. A few words must be said about the chiefs of the enterprise. Francisco Pizarro, born near Truxillo between the years 1471, and was the natural son of a certain Captain Gonzalo Pizarro, who had taught the boy nothing but to take care of pigs. He was soon tired of this occupation, and took advantage of his having allowed one of the animals who were in his charge to stray, not to return to the paternal roof, where he was accustomed to be cruelly beaten for the smallest peccadillo. The young Pizarro enlisted, and after passing some years amidst the Italian wars, he followed Christopher Columbus to Hispaniola in 1510. He served there with distinction, and also in Cuba. Afterwards he accompanied Jorge to Darien, discovered, as has been already mentioned, the Pacific with Balboa, and after the execution of the latter, he assisted Pedrarias Davila, whose favorite he had become, in the conquest of all the country known as Castile d'Or. While Pizarro was an illegitimate child, Diego de Almagro was a foundling, picked up according to some in 1475 at Aldea del Rey, but according to others at Almagro, from which circumstance, as they maintain, he derived his name. He was educated in the midst of soldiers, and while still young went to America, where he had succeeded in amassing a small fortune. Ferdinand de Luque was a rich ecclesiastic of Tobago, who exercised the calling of a schoolmaster at Panama. The youngest of these adventurers was by this time more than 50 years of age, and Garcilaso de la Vega relates that upon their project being known, they became the objects of general derision. Ferdinand de Luque was the most laughed at, and was called by no other name than Hernando el Loco, Ferdinand the Fool. The terms of partnership were soon agreed upon between these three men, of whom two at least were without fear, if they were not all three without reproach. Luque furnished money needed for the armament of the vessels and the pay of the soldiers, and Almagro bore an equal part in the expense, but Pizarro, who possessed nothing but his sword, was to pay his contribution in another manner. It was he who took the command of the first attempt, upon which we shall dwell in some detail, because it was then that the perseverance and inflexible obstinacy of the conquistador first came fully into sight. One of the historians of the conquest of Peru, Augustin de Zarat, relates as follows: having then asked and obtained the permission of Pedro Arias Davila, Francisco Pizarro, after much trouble, equipped a vessel upon which he embarked with 140 men. At the distance of 150 miles from Panama, he discovered a small and poor province named Peru, which caused the same name to be henceforward improperly bestowed upon all the country which was discovered along that coast, for the space of more than 3,600 miles in length. Passing onwards, he discovered another country, which the Spaniards called the Burnt People. The Indians slew so many of his men that he was constrained to retire in great disorder to the country of Chinchama, which is not far distant from the place whence he had started. Almagro, however, who had remained at Panama, fitted out a ship there, upon which he embarked with 70 Spaniards, and descended the coast as far as the river San Juan, 300 miles from Panama. Not having met with Pizarro, he went back northwards as far as the Burnt People, where, having ascertained by certain indications that Pizarro had been there, he landed his men. But the Indians, puffed up by the victory which they had gained over Pizarro, resisted bravely, forced the entrenchments with which Almagro had covered his position, and obliged him to re-embark. He returned, therefore, still following the coastline, until he arrived at Chinchama, where he found Francisco Pizarro. They were much rejoiced at meeting again, and having added to their followers some fresh soldiers whom they had levied, they found their troops amounted to 200 Spaniards, and once more they descended the coast. They suffered so much from scarcity of provisions and from the attacks of the Indians that Don Diego returned to Panama to collect more recruits and to obtain provisions. He took back with him 80 men, with whom, and with those who remained to them, they went as far as the country called Cataymez, a country moderately peopled, and where they found abundance of provisions. They noticed that the Indians of these parts who attacked them and made war against them had their faces studded with nails of gold inserted in holes which they had made expressly for receiving these ornaments. Diego de Almagro returned once again to Panama, whilst his companion waited for him and for the reinforcements which he was to bring with him in a small island called Cock Island, where he suffered much from the scarcity of all the necessaries of life. The Indians kill many of the Spaniards. The Indians kill many of the Spaniards. Upon his arrival in Panama, Almagro could not obtain permission from Los Rios, the successor of Avila, to make new levies, for he had no right, Los Rios said, to allow a greater number of people to go and perish uselessly in a rash enterprise. He even sent a boat to Cock Island to bring away Pizarro and his companions. But such a decision could not be pleasing to Almagro and De Luc. It meant expense thrown away, and it meant the annihilation of the hopes which the sight of the ornaments of gold and silver of the inhabitants of Cataymez had caused them to entertain. They sent therefore a trusty person to Pizarro to recommend him to persevere in his resolution and to refuse to obey the orders of the governor of Panama. But Pizarro in vain held out the most seductive promises. The remembrance of the fatigues which had been endured was too recent, and all his companions, except 12, abandoned him. With these intrepid men, whose names have been preserved, and amongst whom was Garcia de Exers, one of the historians of the expedition, Pizarro retired to an uninhabited island at a greater distance from the coast, to which he gave the name of Gorgona. There the Spaniards lived miserably on mangles, fish, and shellfish, and awaited for 5 months the succor that Almagro and De Luc were to send them. At length, vanquished by the unanimous protestations of the whole colony, who were indignant that people whose only crime was that they had not despaired of success should be left to perish miserably, and as though they were malefactors, Los Rios sent to Pizarro a small vessel to bring him back, with the object of presenting no temptation to Pizarro to make use of this ship to renew his expedition. Not a single soldier was placed on board of her. At the sight of the help which had arrived, and oblivious of all their privations, the 13 adventurers thought of nothing but persuading the sailors who came to seek them to participate in their own hopes. Whereupon, instead of starting again on the route to Panama, they sailed all together towards the southeast, in spite of contrary winds and currents, until, after having discovered the island of St. Clara, they arrived at the port of Tumbez, situated beyond the 3 degrees of south latitude, where they saw a magnificent temple and a palace belonging to the Incas, the sovereigns of the country. The country was populous and fairly well cultivated, but what proved beyond all else seductive to the Spaniards, and made them think that they had reached the marvelous countries of which so much had been said, was the sight of so great an abundance of gold and silver, that these metals were employed not only as finery and ornament by the inhabitants, but also for making vases and common utensils. Pizarro caused the interior of the country to be explored by Pietro de Candia and Alonso de Molina, who brought back an enthusiastic description of it, and he caused some gold vases to be given up to him, as well as some llamas, a quadruped domesticated by the Peruvians. He took 2 natives on board his vessel, to whom he proposed to teach the Spanish language and to use them as interpreters when he should return to the country. He anchored successively at Paita, Saugarata, and in the Bay of Santa Cruz, of which the sovereign, Capellana, received the strangers with such friendly demonstrations that several of them were unwilling to re-embark. After having sailed down the coast as far as Porto Santo, Pizarro set out on his return to Panama, where he arrived after 3 whole years spent in dangerous explorations, which had completely ruined De Luc and Almagro. Pizarro received by Charles V. Pizarro received by Charles V. Pizarro resolved to apply to Charles V before undertaking the conquest of the country which he had discovered, for he could not obtain leave from Los Rios to engage fresh adventurers. So he borrowed the sum required for the voyage, and in 1528 he went to Spain to inform the emperor of the work which he had undertaken. He painted the picture of the countries that were to be conquered in the most pleasing light, and as a reward for his labors, the titles of governor, captain general, and alguazil major of Peru were bestowed upon him and his heirs in perpetuity. At the same time he was ennobled, and a pension of 1,000 crowns was bestowed upon him. His jurisdiction, independent of the governor of Panama, was to extend over a tract of 600 miles along the coast to the south of the Santiago River. It was to be called New Castile, and he was to be the governor, concessions that cost nothing to Spain, for Pizarro had yet to conquer the country. On his side, he undertook to raise a body of 250 men, and to provide himself with the necessary ships, arms, and ammunition. Pizarro then repaired to Truxillo, where he persuaded his 3 brothers Ferdinand, Juan, and Gonzalo to accompany him, as well as one of his half-brothers Martin d'Alcantara. He took advantage of his stay in his native town and at Caceres to try to raise recruits, both there and throughout Estremadura. They did not, however, come forward in large numbers, in spite of the title of Caballeros de la Espada Dorada, which he promised to bestow upon all who would serve under him. Then he returned to Panama, where affairs were not going so smoothly as he had hoped. He had succeeded in getting de Luque named Bishop Protector de los Indios, but for Almagro, whose talents he knew and whose ambition he feared, he had only asked that he should be ennobled, and a gratuity of 500 ducats bestowed upon him, with the government of a fortress which was to be built at Tumbes. Almagro refused to take part in this new expedition. He was not pleased with the meager portion given to him after spending all his money on the earlier expeditions. He wished now to organize one on his own account. It required all Pizarro's address, aided by the promise to give up to Almagro the office of adelantado, to appease him and make him consent to renew the old partnership. Map of Peru. Map of Peru. The resources of the 3 partners were so limited at this time that they could only get together 3 small ships and soldiers, of whom 36 were horse soldiers. The expedition set out in February 1531 under the command of Pizarro and his 4 brothers, whilst Almagro remained at Panama to organize an expedition of supplies. At the end of 13 days' sailing, and after having been carried by a store miles more to the south than he had intended, Pizarro was forced to disembark both men and horses on the shores of the Bay of San Mateo, and to follow the line of the coast on land. This march was a difficult one in a very mountainous country, thinly peopled, and intersected by rivers which had to be crossed at their mouths. At last a place called Coqui was reached, where was found a great booty, which decided Pizarro to send back 2 of his ships. They carried to Panama and Nicaragua spoils to the amount of 30,000 castellanos, as well as a great number of emeralds, a rich booty, which would, according to Pizarro, determine many adventurers to come and join him. Then the conqueror continued his march southwards as far as Porto Viejo, where he was joined by Sebastian Benalcázar and Juan Fernandez, who brought him 12 horsemen and 30 foot soldiers. The effect which had been produced in Mexico by the sight of the horses and the reports of the firearms was repeated in Peru, and Pizarro was able to reach the island of Puna in the Gulf of Guayaquil without encountering any resistance. But the islanders were more numerous and more warlike than their brothers of the mainland, and for 6 months they valiantly resisted all the attacks of the Spaniards. Although Pizarro had received some aid from Nicaragua, brought by Ferdinand de Soto, and although he had beheaded the cacique Tonala and 16 of the principal chiefs, he could not overcome their resistance. He was, therefore, obliged to regain the continent, where the maladies peculiar to the country tried his companions so cruelly that he was forced to stay 3 months at Tumbes, exposed to the perpetual attacks of the natives. From Tumbes he went next to the Rio Puira, discovered the harbor of Paita, the best on this coast, and founded the colony of San Miguel at the mouth of the Chilo, in order that vessels coming from Panama might find a safe shelter. It was here that Pizarro received some envoys from Huascar, who informed him of the revolt of Atahualpa, the brother of Huascar, and asked his aid. At the period when the Spaniards landed to conquer Peru, It extended along the shore of the Pacific Ocean for 1,500 miles and stretched into the interior as far as the imposing chain of the Andes. Originally, the population was divided into savage and barbarous tribes, having no idea of civilization and living in a perpetual state of warfare with one another. For many centuries, affairs had continued in the same state, and there appeared no presage of the coming of a better era, when, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, there appeared to the Indians a man and woman who pretended that they were the children of the sun. They called themselves Manco Capac and Mamaolo and were of majestic appearance. According to Garcilaso de la Vega, towards the middle of the 12th century, they united together a number of wandering tribes and laid the foundations of the town of Cusco. Manco Capac had taught the men agriculture and mechanical arts, whilst Mamaolo instructed the women in spinning and weaving. When Manco Capac had satisfied these first needs of all societies, he framed laws for his subjects and constituted a regular political state. It was thus that the dominion of the Incas, or lords of Peru, was established. At first, their empire was limited to the neighborhood of Cusco, but under their successors, it rapidly increased and extended from the Tropic of Capricorn to the Pearl Islands, a length of 30 degrees. The power of the Incas was as absolute as that of the ancient Asiatic sovereigns. Also, says Zarat, there was perhaps no other country in the world where the obedience and submission of the subjects was carried further. The Incas were to them quasi-divinities. They had but to place a thread drawn from the royal head fillet in the hands of anyone, and the man so distinguished was certain to be everywhere respected and obeyed, and to find such absolute deference paid to the king's order which he carried, that he could alone exterminate a whole province without any assistance from soldiers, and cause to be put to death all the inhabitants, both male and female, because at the mere sight of this thread, taken from the royal crown, the people voluntarily and without any resistance offered themselves up to die. However, the old chroniclers all agree in saying that this unlimited power was always used by the Incas for the well-being of their subjects. Out of a series of 12 kings, who in succession sat on the throne of Peru, there was not one who did not leave behind him the memory of a just prince adored by his subjects. Should we not search in vain through the annals of any other country in the world for facts analogous to these? Must it not be regretted that the Spaniards should have brought war with all its attendant horrors, and the maladies and vices of a different climate, along with what they in their pride called civilization, amongst a rich and happy people, whose descendants, impoverished and debased as they are, have not even the recollection of their ancient prosperity to console them in their irremediable decay. The Peruvians, says Michelet in his admirable Précis de Histoire Moderne, handed down the principal facts to posterity by knots, which they made in ropes. They had obelisks and exact gnomons to mark the equinoxes and solstices. Their year consisted of 365 days. They had erected prodigies of architecture, and they carved statues with amazing art. They formed the most polished and industrious nation of the New World. The Inca Huayna Capac, father of Atahualpa, under whom this vast empire was destroyed, had done much to increase and embellish it. This Inca, who conquered all the country of Quito, had made, by the hands of his soldiers and of the vanquished people, a great row of miles in length from Cusco to Quito, across precipices which had been filled up and mountains which had been leveled. Relays of men, stationed at intervals of a mile and a half from each other, carried the emperor's orders throughout the empire. Such was their police, and if we wish to judge of Peruvian magnificence, we need only instance the fact that the king, when he traveled, was carried on a throne of gold which weighed 0 ducats, and the golden litter upon which the throne rested was borne by the highest personages of the realm. In 1526, when the Spaniards appeared on the coast for the first time, the 12th Inca had lately married, in defiance of the ancient law of the kingdom, the daughter of the vanquished king of Quito, and had had a son of this marriage named Atahualpa, to whom he left this kingdom on his death, which happened about 1529. His eldest son Huascar, whose mother was descended from the Incas, had the remainder of his states. But this partition, so contrary to the customs established from time immemorial, caused such great discontent at Cusco that Huascar, encouraged by his subjects, determined to march against his brother, who would not acknowledge him for his lord and master. Atahualpa, in his turn, had too lately tasted power to be willing to abandon it. He managed by bribes to attach to himself the greater part of the warriors who had accompanied his father during the conquest of Quito, and when the two armies met, fortune favored the usurper. Is it not curious to remark how both in Peru and Mexico the Spaniards were aided by entirely exceptional circumstances? In Mexico, some of the people who had recently submitted to the Aztec race, being mercilessly trampled upon by their conquerors, welcomed the Spaniards as deliverers. In Peru, the strife between two brothers, furious against each other, hinders the Indians from turning all their forces against the invaders whom they might easily have crushed. Pizarro, upon receiving the envoys sent by Huascar to ask his aid against his brother Atahualpa, whom he represented as a rebel and usurper, saw at once all the advantages that might accrue to him from these circumstances. He saw that by espousing the cause of one of the brothers, he could more easily crush them both. Therefore he advanced at once into the interior of the country at the head of a very inconsiderable force, consisting of 62 cavalry and 120 foot soldiers, of whom only 20 were armed with arquebuses and muskets. He was obliged to leave part of his troops to guard San Miguel, in which Pizarro reckoned upon finding a refuge in case of his being unsuccessful, and where in any case all supplies which might arrive could be landed. Pizarro first made for Caxamalca, a small town situated at about 20 days' march from the coast. To reach it he had to cross a desert of burning sand, without vegetation and without water, which extended for 60 miles in length as far as the province of Matup, and where the slightest attack of the enemy, joined to the sufferings endured by the little army, would have been sufficient to crush the whole expedition. One blow, next the troops plunged into the mountains and became entangled in narrow defiles where a small force might have annihilated them. During this march, Pizarro received an envoy from Atahualpa bringing him some painted shoes and gold bracelets, which he was requested to wear at his approaching interview with the Inca. Naturally, Pizarro was lavish in his promises of friendship and devotion, and assured the Indian ambassador that he should be only following the orders given him by the king his master in respecting the lives and property of the inhabitants. From the moment of his arrival at Caxamalca, Pizarro prudently lodged his soldiers in a temple and a palace belonging to the Inca, where they were sheltered from any surprise. Then he sent one of his brothers with De Soto and 20 horse soldiers to the camp of Atahualpa, which was distant only 3 miles, to announce to him his arrival. The envoys of the governor were received with magnificence, and were astonished at the multiplicity of the ornaments and vases made of gold and silver which they saw throughout the Indian camp. They returned, bringing a promise from Atahualpa that he would come on the next day to visit Pizarro, to bid him welcome to his kingdom. At the same time, the envoys gave an account of the wonderful riches they had seen, which confirmed Pizarro in the project which he had formed of seizing the unfortunate Atahualpa and his treasures by treachery. Several Spanish authors, and notably Zarate, disguise these facts, which no doubt appeared to them too odious, and altogether deny the treachery towards Atahualpa. But at the present day, there are extant many documents which force the historian to believe, with Robertson and Prescott, in the perfidy of Pizarro. It was very important for him to have the Inca in his own hands, and to employ him as a tool, just as Cortes had done with Montezuma. He therefore took advantage of the honesty and simplicity of Atahualpa, who placed entire confidence in Pizarro's protestations of friendship, and so was thrown off his guard, to arrange an ambuscade into which Atahualpa was certain to fall. There was not a scruple in the disloyal soul of the conqueror. He was as cool as though he were about to offer battle to enemies who had been forewarned of his approach. This infamous treason must be an eternal dishonor to his memory. Pizarro divided his cavalry into 3 small squadrons, left all his infantry in one body, hid his arquebusiers on the road by which the Inca must pass, and kept 20 of his most determined companions near himself. Atahualpa, wishing to give the Spaniards a great idea of his power, advanced with the whole of his army. He himself was borne upon a kind of bed, decorated with feathers, covered with plates of gold and silver, and ornamented with precious stones. He was accompanied by his principal nobles, carried like himself on the shoulders of their servants, and he was surrounded by dancers and jesters. Such a march was more that of a procession than of an army. As soon as the Inca had nearly reached the Spanish quarters, according to Robertson, Father Vincent Valverde, the chaplain of the expedition, who was afterwards made a bishop as a reward for his conduct, advanced with the crucifix in one hand and his breviary in the other. In an interminable discourse he set forth to the monarch the doctrine of the creation, the fall of the first man, the incarnation, passion, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, the choice made by God of St. Peter to be his vicar upon earth, the power transmitted through him to the popes, and the gift made by Pope Alexander to the King of Castile of all the regions of the New World. When he had expounded all these doctrines, he called upon Atahualpa to embrace the Christian religion, to recognize the supreme authority of the Pope, and to submit to the King of Castile as his legitimate sovereign. If he submitted immediately, Valverde undertook to promise that the king his master would take Peru under his protection and allow him to continue to reign there. But he declared war against him and threatened him with fearful vengeance if he refused to obey and persevered in his impiety. To say the least of it, this was a singular scene and a very strange harangue, alluding to facts which were utterly unknown to the Peruvians, and of the truth of which a more skillful orator than Valverde would not have succeeded in persuading them. If we add that the interpreter knew so little of the Spanish language that it was almost an impossibility for him to translate what he scarcely understood himself, and that the Peruvian language lacked words to express ideas so foreign to its genius, we shall not be much surprised to learn that Atahualpa understood almost nothing of the Spanish monk's discourse. Some sentences, however, which attacked his own power, filled him with surprise and indignation, but he was none the less moderate in his reply. He said that, as master of his own kingdom by right of succession, he could not see how anyone had the power to dispose of it without his consent. He added that he was not at all willing to renounce the religion of his fathers to adopt one of which he had only heard that day for the first time. With regard to the other points touched upon in the discourse, he understood nothing. It was a thing entirely new to him, and he would much like to know where Valverde had learnt so many wonderful things. "In this book," replied Valverde, handing him his breviary. Atahualpa received it with eagerness and turned over some of the leaves with much curiosity. Then, putting it to his ear, he exclaimed, "What you show me there does not speak to me and tells me nothing." With this, he flung the book upon the ground. This served as a signal for the combat, or rather for the massacre. Cannon and muskets came into play, the cavalry sprang forward, and the infantry fell sword in hand upon the stupefied Peruvians. In a few moments, the confusion was at its height. The Indians fled on all sides without attempting to defend themselves. As to Atahualpa, although his principal officers tried to make a rampart of their own bodies, while they carried him off, Pizarro sprang upon him, dispersed or overthrew his guards, and seizing him by his long hair, threw him down from the litter in which he was carried. Only the darkness could arrest the carnage. 4,000 Indians were killed, a greater number wounded, and were taken prisoners. An incontestable proof that there was no real battle is that of all the Spaniards Pizarro alone was hit, and he received his wound from one of his own soldiers who was too precipitately endeavoring to seize upon the Inca. Atahualpa is made prisoner. Atahualpa is made prisoner. From an old print. The booty collected in the camp, and from the dead, exceeded anything the Spaniards could have imagined, and their enthusiasm was proportioned to the conquest of such riches. At first Atahualpa bore his captivity with resignation, which may have been partly due to Pizarro's doing all he could to soothe him, at least by words. But the Inca, soon understanding the unbridled covetousness of his jailers, made a proposal to Pizarro to pay him ransom, and to have a room of 22 feet in length by 16 in width, filled as high as the hand could reach with vases, utensils, and ornaments of gold. Pizarro eagerly agreed to this, and the captive Inca dispatched the necessary orders at once to all the provinces. These were carried out promptly and unmurmuringly. Beyond this, the Indian troops were disbanded, and Pizarro was able to send Soto and 5 Spaniards to Cusco, a town situated more than 600 miles from Caxamalca, while he himself subjugated all the country within a circuit of 300 miles.